Hey guys, it's William Haddadine here with Derek Carrillo Maldonado.
And Nate
In
Latka.
our podcast today, we'll talk to you about refugees and who they are and how they impact the world today. According to the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, the number of refugees and internally displaced people has reached an all-time high since World War II. In 2014, there were almost 60 million refugees and internally displaced people worldwide.
To put that into perspective, that's roughly the entire population of Italy being forced out of their homes.
A refugee is somebody who has been forced to flee their country because of persecution, war, or violence.
To give us a better understanding about refugees and where they're from, we talked to Mrs. Salzman, who teaches a class at Prep about conflicts and refugees. And she has a lot of experience dealing with refugees, and she'll tell us about this in this podcast.
My first encounter with a refugee was when I lived as a child in Raleigh, North Carolina, and my parents were involved through their church, with settling a family from Vietnam. So it was a family of 10 that arrived basically by boat. They were part of the boat people, and they were in a camp in Thailand, and then they were resettled to the United States.
This was her very first encounter with refugees, and she quickly befriended the refugees that came to her hometown, but she didn't really know much about them and why they were there. So this sparked up an interest on refugees, and this encouraged her to use it as her field of study. And then she became a worker at the UN.
I worked for the UN agency that takes care of the world's refugees, the UNHCR. I joined that organization in my early 20s, right after I got my graduate degree. And there I found out a lot about refugees. I was working in the office in Brussels on asylum policy, which is interesting now with all the refugees leaving Syria, especially in other countries, and are trying to get to Europe. That situation was still happening in the 1980s, but not to any degree that it's happening now. But so I learned a lot about how European countries receive refugees and what kind of policies they have in place to do that.
So while Mrs. Salzman was working at the United Nations, she worked for this specific branch called the UNHCR, which stands for the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. She was based in Western Europe, such as Brussels and Geneva, Switzerland. She served on the emergency team, which means that she had to go anywhere at any time with as little as 2 or 3 days' notice to go help refugees, and she'd have to live on a packed bag.
One of the places I went was Rwanda, and I went there a year after the genocide happened there, so this was in the fall of 1995. And my job was to help with the repatriation of refugees, but they were too scared to come back at the time. So I did visit a lot of the transit centers that they had in the country. Basically, refugees, when they would come home, they would first go to the transit center, which was like a refugee camp. So they would still live in tents, and you'd try to register them and figure out if they were safe to go back to their home villages or not. They would have to stay there for a while. So I did go to transit camps. I would cross the border into Uganda and Tanzania and get counts about how many people have come across the border. That was the only way that we could do that, was by asking the border officials for figures. But I never actually went to one of their camps, but I had a lot of colleagues who had spent a lot of time in those refugee camps.
Usually when refugees first leave their home country, they don't go straight to a new country like the United States or Turkey. They go to what are called refugee camps, which are basically camps that hold all the refugees waiting to be admitted, or at least have the opportunity to go to a new country. But the problem is that these are not the best places to live. They're very dirty, it's very monotonous, which means it's the same thing all day, every day, until you flee. And it's crowded, so imagine the Dodge Expressway at 5:45 p.m., except 24 hours in a limited space with a lot more people involved.
Life in a camp is very difficult. When you first arrive in a refugee camp, you can imagine what has just happened. So the reason why people have left their home is usually very traumatic. Something has happened that's very traumatic. So they've either lost family members, directly that have been, killed or disappeared. They often, in chaos, in many war situations, they get separated from, children get separated from their parents, if you can imagine how that is. You are in a situation that is very uncertain. And you've had to get to this camp. And as you know about what's happening in Europe now, often that journey is very dangerous. And so when you first arrive in a camp, you've just escaped a very traumatic situation. So that's tough. Living in a camp is very limited, very limited. You have really a very strict routine that becomes just very difficult to deal with. The refugees that I've talked with over time say that one of the hardest things about a refugee camp is the monotony of it, just the monotonous life that they live. So with really no hope and no certainty about their future.
We interviewed a refugee named Amnet Al-Kindi, who fled the war in Iraq in 2003. Today she lives in Virginia pursuing a college degree.
Refugee visa, and we got accepted after two years, and it was very hard, because we weren't sure if we were gonna get it or not. And then the reason for that was it's unbearable there. We cannot stay in Iraq anymore. It's very dangerous. Bombs everywhere, people dying. So my dad decided to, because we are only two girls, so it was the best decision to leave the country and to go somewhere safe. And the option was going to U.S.
To clarify, her family applied for a refugee visa and was accepted 2 years later. The conditions were very harsh in Iraq.
Your best friend dying in front of you when you go to school, it's not safe. You worry all the time if your dad comes back home or not when he goes to work, all that. I was 14 and my sister 16.
Faced with harsh conditions even at young ages, many refugees have trouble finding hope for their future. However, some refugees like Amnet are lucky enough to be selected for resettlement by a host country. The United States sets a number of refugees that they want to accept each year. This year it will be 100,000 refugees. The United States decides which countries they receive refugees from, and the refugees are selected, they're put on a list, and then they're screened for health problems.
So they have to go through medical check. They have to go through, of course, security. Now, Department of Homeland Security is also in the refugee camps. They're in the field. They're making sure that the vetting process is very rigorous to make sure that they're not going to be a danger to anybody in the United States. So once they go through all of that, they can be selected to come, and then they are brought. Then once they're selected, they are provided transportation and time to get settled in the United States, but they have to pay back their plane tickets. So if you can imagine a family of 6 coming from Asia, that's probably about $12,000 that they're going to have to pay back. They have to pay back the plane tickets, and they only get 3 months of assistance once they're here.
In addition to the economic struggles they face, refugees also have to learn English from scratch. Many of their educational achievements are not recognized here in America. For instance, some doctors' medical licenses are not recognized here, so they have to go to medical school all over again. According to the Washington Post, Nebraska is among the top 5 most welcoming states for refugees in America.
The more refugees that arrive in Nebraska, the more help is needed.
Each and every one of you can help these refugees in their struggle with the new chapters in life.
You might wonder, how could one person potentially change a whole family's life?
Well, Derek, there are various opportunities within our community and even within PrEP itself that is dedicated to aid the incoming refugees in their transition to life in America.
Some of these opportunities include various mission collections during community period, winter clothing donations, refugee move-ins. This past week, French Club sold croissants and bonbons during the school day. All of these proceeds go to the purchase of new furniture and renovation for the local refugees' new homes.
Thanks, guys, for listening to our podcast. We hope you learned a lot from this podcast, and we hope it encouraged you to go out and help other refugees, because they're people like us and they all need help. Signing off, this is William Haddadine,
Derek Correa Maldonado.
And Nate Lapka.
Thanks again for listening.